A wonderful video on Chautauqua. What was your aha moment that there was a Chautauqua? And you go back a few ways, back to Edison.
I go back to '91. That year, that was the first year we stumbled on Chautauqua. We just happened to drive in from camping and saw it was 4th of July. We couldn't believe this place. We put all our belongings under a bench and toured the place, and we came back and the bench was gone and everybody was gone, but our things were still there just where we left it. We said, this is a pretty honest place, so the next year we rented and we've been here ever since, so it's about 25 years. I don't go back to Edison.
Talk about your life, though. I always like to ask the question, what did your mom and dad do?
My father was in various businesses. He sold Encyclopedia Britannica from door to door. He bought the first health food business in the country. My wife said I should have taken over. I would be wealthy today, but anyway, that didn't happen. I grew up in Syracuse, went to school there. Carol, my wife, we've been dating since we're 15. This is our 60th wedding year today, this year. We're old-fashioned types. Then I went to Cornell undergrad and went to Syracuse.
By the way, was that love at first sight?
Second sight.
Second sight? What happened to first sight?
One of my friends fixed us up, and that was it. So it stuck, still today.
Okay, good.
But anyway, I went to Cornell, then I went to Syracuse Law School, practiced law until 1991, retired early because of a prior bypass. It's my 35th anniversary of my first bypass, so I'm a survivor. And I retired to here, and I wouldn't change a bit of it.
You practiced law. What type of law did you practice?
I did litigation defense work in Binghamton at a time when it was very collegial and kind, and things have changed. But I did that for 33 years.
Was Warren Anderson a big part of that world?
Warren Anderson was in that town, yes, and all the other lawyers you may know from there, yes.
I just got to ask, did your paths cross with Eugene Gerhardt, who was the biographer of Jackson?
Right, and he was also writing for the New York Bar Association for years of their bar journal. I know Gene quite well, yes.
So you come here, and what was your first sense of this, other than that nobody walked away with your belongings?
Well, everybody has the same feeling about Chautauqua. It's such a marvelous place with such diverse things to do, from arts to lectures to concerts, and we just went everywhere, every day for everything. And we brought our friends here, and we said, get a good night's sleep, because tomorrow morning you're going to go to the women's club and learn how the guy plays the bells. Then we're going to a 10:45 lecture, then a noon meeting, then a 2 o'clock lecture, then the symphony, but we have to go out early because there's an opera cabaret that night. And they said, you do this every day? But we did for 3 years. Can't take enough of it.
And one of the things that you and I talked about, in fact, was that you somehow now give bus tours, and through that time period you've actually had a chance to gather up a boatload of facts which most folks probably don't know about.
I got interested in that from Laurie Stanton wanted me to do some for Rhodes Scholar, and I started to shadow other people who did bus tours. And last year I did 6 a week. I did about 90 bus tours so far, and tried to check with John Smits for other history and learn little stories on the way and things that affected me personally. I like doing the bus tours because my hope is I can get people who take the tour to love and enjoy Chautauqua as much as I do. And if they get off the bus and say, many of them, you really must love this place. And if it shows, I think I did a good job.
So you get on the bus. Are you the driver and tour guide, or just the guide?
No, just the guide. The bus drivers do the best of it. Most of us start, just a quick tour of what we do. We start at the main gate. We go down Miller. We go to the lake, over Whitfield, back to North Lake, up Prospect, past the Arts Quad. We wander around on Palestine. We skirt around Janes, not to interfere with the Hall of Philosophy because the bus makes too much noise. We go up to Massey and down south past the Hall of Christ, down Park, and back to the end and past Miller Park, and that's the route. It takes about an hour and a half to give the tour. I won't certainly go through that because everybody here knows 90% of what the buildings are and what happens there. But along the way, I picked up different stories about different things, which I think makes it fun for those people on the bus. For example, when we first start out, we talk about, and I started this, I wondered why 20,000 people showed up in 1974 first week, 2 weeks, 20,000 people. My view is it's based upon the end of the Civil War. 620,000 soldiers died in that war, many from disease. More people died in the Civil War than all our wars combined up until Vietnam. It only ended in 1865, and Chautauqua starts in 1874. The country was in ruins, brothers shooting brothers and relatives. It was horrendous. People were looking for something pleasant to do. And coincidentally, John Hal Vincent and Lewis Miller, both in their early 40s, had the job of providing a place to give a Sunday school assembly where Sunday school teachers could get instructions in religion. And Vincent's idea was not only religion, but he wanted to have literature subjects, he wanted to do science. Back in those days, in the early days, they had clergy from all religions. And I say in the bus, you know, in those days, social media was people talking to other face to face, an old-fashioned idea. They wrote letters to each other. And back in the 1850s, there were more magazines circulated in this country than ever since. So Vincent got in all these church magazines, and he decided to advertise Chautauqua. So he must have done a good job because, as I say, in the summer of 1874, 20,000 people showed up. No cars, no buses. They came by 6 or 7 steamboats on the lake, off trains, and they just flooded into this place. And they all lived in tents for 2 weeks. So they must have loved what they did. So that's how it started.
Oh, just as a pause on that 1874, people come in, they have no idea how many people are going to show up.
No.
How did they react? I mean, how did the Chautauqua staff kind of just 10 after 10 after 10? I mean, gee.
I wondered why and how, and I never found out how there's so many big wall tents, you know, around Miller Park and all over the place. And one thing that Vincent said, there's 3 things I won't have anything to do with because he thought they were depraved. There would be no card playing, no dancing, and no liquor. And of course, we know that's been true ever since. But anyway, there was a Sunday school camp here, and I think one of the ladies who worked for Vincent or Miller said, you better look at Chautauqua Lake, because there's already a summer camp going there, probably some tents, and they did a good job in instructing these people because they flooded ever since. Another thing that people don't remember is that Vincent, when he was a pastor in a small town, Ulysses Grant was one of his parishioners. So here it is, 1874, and they're thrilled that 20,000 people come, and Vincent, I assume, says to Miller, I'm going to get Ulysses Grant to come because he's the President of the United States. If we get 20,000 people this year, imagine how many people will come next year. And Vincent probably said he can't live in a tent because he's the President of the United States. And this is why the Miller Cottage was built. Lewis Miller had a prefabricated homes in his factory. So Vincent sent to Miller, bring one of your homes here. So in the fall of 1874, they brought the Miller Cottage, which has been there ever since, and that's where Ulysses Grant stayed next year, and Thomas Edison stayed, and Henry Ford stayed, and Harvey Firestone stayed. And that's the oldest building on the campus, except for the Evans house right across the street from us. So that's how it started, and it just, the next year they started building rooming houses and houses all over the place. Most of the buildings you see, from the amphitheater to everything else, were all built between 1874 and 1911. All the main buildings were built. This place just sprung up like daisies because of the attraction it had for many people. And also the AMP, another thing, stories about the AMP. Everybody knows about the Roosevelt I Hate War speech, but in 1898, Susan B. Anthony was here talking about women's suffrage. 1928, Alexander Graham Bell brought Helen Keller. That was the 4th, not the first, the 4th annual conference on how to teach deaf people to speak. That was the title of the conference. So they're doing speeches and doing performances. And Vincent says, you know, they can't hear applause. How can we tell these deaf people who are learning to speak, that we like what they do? So he said everybody should take out their handkerchief and wave at them. That would be applause for deaf people. But one of the first stories I found out was, I heard about it and I looked online and found out there was a letter to the New York Times about a gentleman who didn't think that was such a good idea, and I think it's so cute. I have a copy if you want it for later. It's called, "To the Editor of the New York Times, recent large political meetings have impressed me with one fact, namely that the so-called Chautauqua Salute, The waving of handkerchiefs ought to be suppressed. It's a menace to the health of the public. The air in halls where large crowds gather is bad enough without the addition of germs from hundreds and thousands of handkerchiefs waving wildly. Even with the unwarranted assumption that all the handkerchiefs are clean, there are germs enough already in the pocket in which they're always carried to render a handkerchief that has never even been used an object capable of spreading disease. New York City, sincerely, GMW, October 22nd, 1904. So, I mean, I read this on the bus, and people get a kick out of it, but I want people to enjoy what they hear. They won't remember the date these buildings were built or how many people came, but this, I think, is interesting. The word of Chautauqua spread to the New York Times all over. Within the first 20 years, there were 250 Chautauquas all over the United States, reading circles, mimicking Chautauqua. In the early 1900s, there was 150 traveling Chautauqua shows having nothing to do with Chautauqua, but they captured the idea of having musical events and speakers, and they just traveled all over the country for years. So this is a great idea, which apparently attracted the attention of a lot of people.
So, as you drive around and you're talking to these folks, are you learning along the same way? I mean, you've done a lot of research, but at the same time, do people raise their hand and say, hey, my great-great-grandfather was here, and this is a story?
Yeah, I learned that, and there's another story I tell you about the St. Elmo that somebody responded to me. Here's another thing that happened. I mean, these are personal events. Everybody knows about the bell tower, and that 6 o'clock and noon and 8 o'clock, somebody who plays the chimes on the bells and plays music. I met a guy named Joseph Shapiro 18 years ago. He was a retired principal from New York City. He was a teacher in New York City. He and I were walking to a PFLAG meeting in the Women's Club. The chimes are playing, and I tell people on the bus, you remember Perry Como? Everybody says yes. Remember the song Round and Round? Joe Shapiro wrote that song.
Oh, wow.
He wrote a few songs when he was young, but he didn't sell enough to make a business out of it, so he became a teacher. Somebody knew that he was in Chautauqua. As he and I were walking to the Women's Club, they were playing Round and Round on the bells. The man was in tears. He was in his late 60s. He wrote this song when he was in his 20s, and here he is in Chautauqua hearing the song he wrote. I mean, that gets you here. And the people like to hear these stories, connect other people from Chautauqua. They know enough, they can read all the literature about the bell tower and how many bells are there and when it was built and why it was built, and the pier building the same way, but I think something like that, attracts their attention.
When you work your way, drive down by Palestine Park, which really was the first sort of piece of infrastructure talking about the Holy Land, what do you talk about?
I just mentioned that was commissioned by Vincent the first year. I don't know who built it, but it was built by 1875, and I talked to some friends here that they, in the wintertime, they used to go ice skating on Palestine Park, on the Red Sea, the Dead Sea. But anyway, that was interesting, and also people don't realize, many of you were here at a community dinner, 100 years ago, 1914, last year, Al Engel brought his light plane to Chautauqua and was giving rides to all the ladies around Chautauqua Lake. And he also was given the first airline pilot's license to deliver the first airmail, postcards from Celeron to Mayville. The plane was so light, all they could carry were postcards. So that's a little history about Chautauqua that has nothing to do with the religion and everything else, but I think it's interesting. So we talk about that because they were there. Then we go by Miller Park, of course, which is the historic place where everybody came, and we talk about what people did and the lectures that were there. But what's interesting, people here may remember, 1999 was the 125th anniversary of Chautauqua. 100 of us dressed up in old Victorian clothes. We woke up at 4 o'clock in the morning. We drove to Mayville and got on the Chautauqua Bell. We came to Chautauqua at sunrise and repeated the exact same sunrise service that Chautauqua did back in the 1870s. And I always wondered, when you have a religious service outdoors, who plays the music? It was a trumpet. A soft trumpet played the music. Chautauqua had tables with breakfast food set out for us. And 300 of our closest friends who we didn't know woke up at sunrise to be there for this repeat of an old thing. We try to tell people on the bus, we like our history, we try to repeat it. At the end of the day, as we waved goodbye to the Chautauqua Belle, which left the dock, we realized that 100 of our cars are still parked in Mayville. So we all had to get a ride, and that was a little joke on us, so it was a great day. So we repeat history, and everybody has done that from time to time, so that's a good story. Also, after we left Miller Park, we go by Prue Spink's house called Fairpoint Cottage, that pink house that was built in 1872. Apparently there were homes here and buildings here before they came to Chautauqua. But 2 years after 1874, they started the Chautauqua Daily. It's been printed every year since. And I asked people on the bus, you people, you know what the motto of the New York Times is? Who knows the motto of the New York Times? All the news that's fit to print. The motto of the Daily is, all the news that fits, we print. So that's good. Then they talk about Thomas Edison, who was in his 40s, came here, and he fell madly in love with Mina Miller, the 18-year-old daughter of Lewis Miller. But it was mutual. Unfortunately, Thomas Edison was very, very hard of hearing, so he taught Mina Miller Morse code. So they talked back to each other in Morse code, and the time came to propose. He tapped on her arm in Morse code, "Will you marry me?" And she tapped on his arm, "Yes, I will." And it was a very successful marriage. They were happy until their dying days, and it lasted a very, very long time. Another little story that would, I think it's shed some light on who the people were here.
Now, would Edison spend time in the summer here during his lifetime? Was he here a lot, or was it just periodic?
He came a lot, and because he came and because Grant came, that's why Harvey Firestone came, and some big luminaries, and Henry Ford came. They stayed in the Miller Cottage over time. You know, it was 2 weeks the first year, and then it got to 3 weeks and expanded to what we now know as 9. But a lot of people who I didn't know came here. I just check on this by talking to John Schmitz. In fact, John Schmitz came, the first year he came before he was hired, he stayed with Carol and I, and we introduced him to Chautauqua. In those days, the archivist's office was in the basement of the library. I mean, imagine Chautauqua went over 100 years with no archives, with all these papers and artifacts just corroding and rotting until Hale Oliver was gracious enough to spend the money to turn what used to be the opera rehearsal hall, that red brick building, to the archives building. So finally we have that, and he's a gem because we learned more from him than anybody about the history of Chautauqua.
You then continue on, and your next part of this is the gardens. I mean, Chautauqua is just replete with wonderful gardens. Are there stories behind all of those gardens?
Well, as you go down Whitfield, the first thing you come to is the Campbell Memorial Garden, and I just point out to people, even in Bester Plaza, we all miss Ryan Kiblin sorely, but the first thing I do when I go to Bester Plaza is point out those big circles of flowers that 4 times a year, every single flower is individually picked up and replaced by others, to remind people of the loving care that the gardening department does to Chautauqua. And as we go by all the homes, the care that people take with their properties. They see these old homes that are just in miraculous condition, and I think that speaks to the quality of the people here who try to keep them up. And yes, and there are over 20 gardens, memorial gardens, and I think it's a great idea that people, to honor their family and loved ones, plant these gardens which are open to the public. And every now and then we go by them, and there's 3 or 4 gardeners slaving away to keep them pretty looking. And people are impressed with that quite a bit.
Tell me about the King's Daughters and Sons. I drive by, I see that, and I have no idea what they are.
Well, the King's Daughters and Sons is it's an organization that has about 150 chapters in Canada and many in America. They try to get young people together to come here to go back to their hometown to become missionaries, to do good works. They do good works in Native American places. They do work in running hospitals. When you go down Palestine, as we do, we go by their headquarters, which is that red brick building. That's the international headquarters of the Order of King's Daughters and Sons. So, and the white building across from the Bester home was given to them by Dolores Robley. She owned Buster Brown Shoes, an old shoe factory years ago. And she donated that building so they could have a dormitory for the kids who come here to study, to be, as I say, not priests, but just, it's like a grown-up Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts area. They go back to their hometown and do good work.
Nearby there is the Bester home as well. And when you drive by Arthur Bester's home, what do you say about Arthur Bester?
Well, that he lived there from 1907 to 1944, and he was one of the persons who increased the amount of arts here in Chautauqua. He was the one who brought John Phillips Sousa's band here. He was the one who encouraged the opera to start in 1929, and the same year the symphony started. So the opera company is the second oldest summer opera company in the country. They're both union organized and they run well. So we got a lot of different things coming. And we try to impress upon people. When I'm on the bus tour, I give them that weekly sheet to show there's 30 or 40 events a day and here's where they're performed. They like that.
Do they ask you how they could possibly deal with 30 or 40 events in a day?
We find that by Friday comes around, they finally know what this place is all about and where to go, but then by Saturday they have to leave. So there's thought to make sure that everybody who comes to Chautauqua for the first time at least gets a bus tour to familiarize themselves with some of the history and where things are, because this is a daunting place. I tell them also, and this is true, not a day goes by that I don't notice something after being here for 25 years that I never noticed before. And I point out that, you know, about the architecture. People remember Paul Goldberger came to lecture once. He's a very famous architect. He's in the New York Times, and someone asked him in the lecture, compare Chautauqua to Disney World in Florida. And he said, it's very easy. Disney World in Florida is imperfect because it's perfect. Chautauqua is perfect because it's imperfect. Things grew up to serve a need, and it's kind of funky, but that's more beautiful to him than an orderly Disney World, which I think is great.
What do you tell them about the CLSC?
4 years after Chautauqua started, you're talking 1878, Vincent decided that he wanted to start books read by people all over the country. So he started the CLSC, which at that time was a 4-year college-level course, and you've seen the diplomas all over. In fact, in 1883, the state of New York accredited Chautauqua to issue college degrees after 4 years of study, which, because there were very few universities around the country that people could afford. And again, within a couple of years, he had thousands of people reading in reading circles all over the country. That started till, it ended in the early 1900s, because by that time, you could get college education and junior colleges and libraries all over the country were doing it. Then it turned to what we now know as symbolism. You read 9 books, or 9 authors come a year, and that's the continuation of CLSC. When I get to Hall of Christ, I go through the whole graduation ceremony and dressing in white and following a brass band and walking up the back of the Hall of Philosophy when the little kids are throwing rose petals at your feet. I mean, they think it's hysterical. And I tell them, you talk about it, it sounds very sophomoric, but to those of us, and you all know it, you do it, it's very deeply meaningful. And it's the backbone of many things that go on here. And it's kind of a corny story, but they like it. I like it. I love it. Another thing we talked about, when you go by the arts campus, there's a few cute stories. I don't know if it's true, but the story is that when Patty McBride, you all saw the arts this summer, when Patty came in Ban Phu, somebody decided to polish the amphitheater floor because a ballet is coming. And that's very dangerous for ballet dancers. The theory and the story goes that she bought a case of Coca-Cola and mopped it all over the floor and let it dry to become sticky so that when the ballet dancers came, before we have the new rubberized floor, they wouldn't kill themselves.
Wow.
Also, everybody knows about the practice shacks. 1924, George Gershwin had just composed Rhapsody in Blue. He was in New York City. He was running 3 different Broadway shows. At that time, Walter Damrosch, who was the director of the New York Symphony, went right up to Gershwin after he heard Rhapsody in Blue, said, I want to commission you to write a concerto for an orchestra. But he says, I'm too busy. I got 3 Broadway shows going. I don't know how I'm going to do it. Back to Chautauqua. There was a music program, piano program, in Sherwood at the time. The director was some piano teacher from Australia. He got in touch with Damrosch and said, he can come, that is Gershwin, to Chautauqua. I will squirrel him away in the Terry cottage. Nobody can bother him till 4 o'clock. he can write what he wants for his concerto in F. He spent time there and in the practice shack we all now know is the Gershwin practice shack, and that was 1925. So there's another history attachment from Chautauqua to music in the music world. So people like that story. That's verified by everybody.
Children's school. That's a major part of most everybody's upbringing. The grandchildren, children, whatever. When you drive by that quad, what do you talk about?
Well, we go through the whole age group. From children from 3 to 6 who go to the children's school. We point out they're picked up by school buses all over Chautauqua. And after that, they can go to the Boys and Girls Club. We end up going down Park and talk about the Boys and Girls Club and how 600 kids come every morning from 9 to noon and 2 to 4. And after that, they can go have the lectures. And we talk about how old you can be to get a senior pass, gate pass. Well, you always ask them that. A few people on the bus know, but they're surprised that at the grand old age of 90, you can come back for free. So you can go from 3 to 90 and above. You have something to do with Chautauqua, which interests people. We talk about the Higgins Hall, which is the cinema. Back it was called Higgins Hall. That's where Teddy Roosevelt was served breakfast when he came in 1905. So there's a lot of history there.
Okay, you got Cynthia Norton here, and you also talk about buglers and taps and all that stuff. What's the story you tell?
Thanks to Cynthia, she gave me a book. There's lots of stories about Norton. Apparently, her great-grandfather, O.W. Norton, Oliver Wilcox Norton, was in the Civil War. He's 23 years old. And in the Civil War, everything that was done in the Civil War, all the commands were done by bugle. How to get up, when to advance, when to retreat, when to get on your horse. There were 20 or 30 bugle calls for everything because the bugle could be heard at long distances. And O.W. was the bugler in this regiment. And his commanding officer, Dan Butterfield, one day decided that he didn't like the call that they used after tattoo, which would mean go to your quarters. It wasn't called taps then, that was lights out. He didn't like it. So he whistled a tune to O.W. And O.W., together with Dan Butterfield, composed what we now know as taps. There's only 4 notes. A bugle only plays about 6 notes. All the bugle calls you've ever heard on a bugle, 6 notes, you can do everything. Charge, advance. So he wrote taps. The custom was in the Army in those days that all the men had words for all their bugle calls. And he decided, that is Dan Butterfield, that O.W. should play taps for his regiment one night in July of 1862. And the men had words to it, and the words were, put out the lights, go to sleep, go to sleep, go to sleep, for all the notes of what we now know as taps. All the other buglers and other regiments came and repeated it, and now we know why the words go to sleep, it's played at every funeral, every military person. You're putting out the lights and you're going to sleep. Well, I mean, even O.W., he wrote hundreds of letters, which I'll talk about in a minute. And this is what he wrote in a letter about taps that his commanding officer told him. There's something singularly beautiful and appropriate in the music of this wonderful call. Its strains are melancholy yet full of rest and peace. Its echoes linger in the heart long after its tone has ceased to vibrate in the air. And listen to this, like Handel's Largo, which we play here. It's immortal. So he was in the Civil War. How did he end up at Chautauqua? One of his cousins was named Strong Vincent, a cousin of John Hale Vincent. Unfortunately, Strong Vincent died in the Battle of Gettysburg. But before that, he told O.W. that my uncle, Bishop Vincent, is starting a place in Chautauqua called the Sunday School Assembly, and maybe you ought to check it out later. And that's why Cynthia's here, that's why her father Paul is here, that's why everybody from the Norton family eventually ended up in this area. In fact, O.W., when he left the Army, he co-founded a steel company, or American Can. He's very successful. When he came here, his sister went to Sherman, New York, and O.W. and Sherman, sister rather, donated the Sherman Library, where there were a lot of letters like these, not the originals, they're still looking for the letters, right? They're lost. So there's a connection between O.W. and Vincent. He comes here, and he loved opera. And he passed away in 1920, and his wife, in his honor, finally built Norton Hall, which was built in 1929. It's interesting because it's one of the first monolithic poured concrete buildings in the United States. And because O.W. loved opera, but he didn't like it in foreign languages, he wanted to hear it sung in English so he could understand it, the provision was that Norton Hall should be used only for opera, and only for opera to be sung in English, why we do that ever since to this day. It's also why Jay Lessinger loves it too. Also, after he passed away, that is O.W., it's Ralph Norton, his son, became a president of Chautauqua after Arthur Bester in the 40s. And he was the one who helped design and make sure that Norton Hall would be built the way it is. And when he became a president of Chautauqua in the 40s, the fountain we now see in Bester Plaza was reproduced and made in the same style as Norton Hall. And I tell people there's 4 words inscribed on the fountain. You know what they're? Music, heart, religion, and knowledge, which is the basis and backbone of Chautauqua. So many people from so many different places are interconnected. It's just amazing.
And the reliefs on Norton Hall are the moods of music and the birth of beauty.
Anyway, I asked Cynthia, and she gave me the entire family tree, and I tried to understand the whole thing. But anyway, that's the part of the Norton family connection to Chautauqua, and why Cynthia's here, eventually. And her father, Paul, was instrumental in helping co-found and help develop the Webb's restaurant, right? And a marina in Chautauqua, and helped donate what was called...
What's now Chautauqua Lake Marina.
Okay. And also the pool that's now in Norton Hall, and Turner, rather.
Yeah.
The swimming pool that's there. So
Norton Natatorium, they called it.
Still
called. I mean,
okay.
It says it on the plaque.
So the Norton family is deeply involved and embedded into Chautauqua for many, many reasons.
St. Elmo's Fire.
This is my favorite story. When we go by the St. Elmo building has been here since the 1880s. At one time it was a hotel. And there's a young gentleman, back in 1970s it was a hotel. A young man named Carl Kurlander, who was a high schooler, in 1977 came to work as take the luggage from people. There are 2 boys and 10 women. And the busboy, the bellhops rather, would help bus the tables. So Carl Kurlander started bussing the tables for a gal that he fell in love with. She smiled at him, and he couldn't stand it. He said to himself, and he wrote about it, someday I'm going to change her name, meaning I'm going to marry this lady. But she's much older. She's 20 and he's 17. He keeps writing to her. He reaches out to her all over the place. He got to the point where he was really stalking her. He would write letters to her. He'd visit her at her home. And he said in one of the articles about him, it's what you call stalking today. If you do it now, go see a doctor and take medication. Get over it. He wrote many, many letters. And finally, he decided to write a love story. He went to Duke University and he spent some time. He wrote an 18-page love story, repeating what he felt for her and what went on in the Elmo with all the other guys. And she thought it was a wonderful story. He thought he'd really impress her, that he really loved her. She liked the story, but she didn't care for him that much. But she said, it's written so good, why don't you take up writing as a career? So he ends up at Duke, and in his senior year, he decides to apply to Universal Studios to be a script writer. And they accept him based upon this story. A year after that, they hire him in Universal Studio, and they're looking around for a script for a movie. And he brings out his 18-page story, the title of which was St. Elmo's Fire. My love, my fire for this lady. That's what he called it, St. Elmo's Fire. And you guessed it, that became the movie St. Elmo's Fire, when Demi Moore and all these young brat-packed actors had their first chance in a good movie. he invited Lynn Lice, his so-called girlfriend. She went to meet all the actors, and that's the basis for St. Elmo's Fire. They didn't say it happened in the St. Elmo's Hotel in Chautauqua. They renamed a fictional bar in Washington, D.C. the St. Elmo, around which all the action took place. But I tell people, whenever I go by that building, St. Elmo, I think about the movie St. Elmo's Fire. It's a kind of a crazy connection, but that's one of my favorite stories about Chautauqua.
Another magnificent building is the Hall of Christ. What do you say about that?
The Hall of Christ was built in 1916 to be a church, but because of other places that provided that, like Hurlbut Church, we go by there and talk about that. We go by Fowler Kellogg. That used to be in the middle of Bester Plaza. In 1905, they picked it up and moved it to where it is now to make Bester Plaza more open. But the Hall of Christ is where I start talking about the CLSC because of the fact that the Hall of Christ now is really a classroom, and we talk about how we line up there and swear that we read all the 12 books and all the parade, and they get a big kick out of that. It's no longer being used as a church services.
Alumni Hall, right there too. That's all part of that.
Yeah, back to CLSC. Remember, CLSC started in 1878, and the first class graduated 4 years after. Most people did it by mail. I've read some of the exams women took from all over the country on mathematics, on astronomy, on all kinds of things, and got these degrees. The first class that graduated donated what we now know as the Octagon Building. I mean, the Pioneer Hall. Pioneer Hall, that was the first building. The second class that graduated donated the Octagon Building. And the third class that graduated donated what we now know as Alumni Hall. And I talk about that, and that gets into the 9 books we see every summer, and which brings into play the Hall of Philosophy and all the afternoon lectures that go on there and the weddings that take place there. Another corny story I heard from a lady who was worked at this women's club. We know how the authors come every Thursday and they talk about their book and they have questions. And one lady was walking across the street bringing an author for a book. I don't remember who it was. And he said, "What am I supposed to do?" And he said, "Well, we expect you to give a talk for about 45 minutes and then they'll ask you questions and answers." And he said, "I don't have a talk prepared. I'm just here to answer questions." So the lady must have been very clever, because when she went over to the Hall of Philosophy, he's sitting down behind the podium, and she gets up and starts to introduce him and says very casually, "Before I want to get on further, I would like to ask him one question. What happened in your life to cause you to write this book?" He stood up and gave a 45-minute extemporaneous, from the heart talk, which is probably the best one all summer from an author, which is what we like here, rather than just, I'm going to read from my book. So that's another neat story back of the CLSC stories.
You have reference to the Studebaker home wedding gift.
Toward the end of the tour, when we go down Park, talk about, we pass by the Episcopal Cottage, and I don't know why I do this, but it's kind of corny. By that time they know I'm corny, so it's all right. That beautiful little church reminds me of a cartoon I saw in the New Yorker once. It was a little white church, and I tell them, on the sign on the church it said Church of God, and it's empty, and there's a sign in the driveway that said, "For sale by owner." Then we go down Park and pass one of the most beautiful places here is the Burgesson Nature Classroom. Those classrooms in pews in the woods. And I point out that we have many classes there about Indian lore and nature, and what a better place to learn about nature than in a classroom in this beautiful ravine and wooded setting. Then we go by the Boys and Girls Club and talk about these herd of kids who come. On the way back, we pass by several houses. First,
By the way, isn't that the oldest?
1898, it's the oldest day camp, continuous day camp, still operating in America, by far. But anyway, we pass by, there's a Studebaker home. There's another blue home on North Lake that's since into condos. But the Studebaker home, it's a red brick home with limestone trim. And the story goes, one of the Studebakers gave it to one of their daughters as a wedding present. So I asked people on the bus, "What did you get for a wedding?" And I say, "I remember my wife and I got a silver Ronson cigarette lighter and a silent butler." You remember those things? And the next house we come to is the WCTU house, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which coincidentally was started in 1874, the same year that Chautauqua began. So apparently, although everybody in Chautauqua was staying in tents, they were building their home for the WCTU the same year. Things sprang up very fast. And it's another reason why Chautauqua has been dry, obviously, because the WCTU sponsored that, as did we. Then I mentioned our winter bowling league, called the Purity and Temperance Bowling League, the name of which comes from the WCTU house, because we have to take a big oath in the fall to be pure and temperate, and be kind to kids and stop at all the stop signs, and then we go out and bowl and have dinner and drink. But I tell them it's the thought that counts. We remember the WCTU. Next building we come to is the Women's Club, 1898. That's how long that's been there. And remember when Roosevelt gave his I Hate War speech in 1934? Well, Eleanor came the same year. Trying to think what the story is that goes, oh yeah, she said to the women, now that we're here, I want to invite you all to the White House for lunch. People here know I frame pictures. There's a picture in the second floor of the Women's Club of all the ladies who came to the White House for lunch. January 16, 1935, 300 women from Chautauqua are in this picture with their little black hats that you women wore back then, standing next to Eleanor Roosevelt, because you went to the White House for lunch because she invited you. How remarkable it is that all these people got to the White House in the dead of winter in 1935. You look at the storms now, it's just amazing. And the next story that came is about Eleanor Roosevelt. She was there for a couple other things. Someone made a trinket out of tea bags. And they handed out these tea bags to everybody who went to this little affair. And on the tea bags, there was a little sticker. It said, "We women are like tea bags. You never know how strong we are until we get into hot water." I still have that in my dresser. So, I mean, that's things that happen here which I think are important to lighten things up, besides all the deep history that goes on here.
When you drive by the Athenaeum Hotel, which is sort of the iconic building here, what do you talk about that?
Well, that was built just before the turn of the century, and imagine it cost $150,000 to build back then. It's the second oldest all-wood hotel east of the Mississippi, still being used. But one thing that people who've been here a long time don't realize, we're sorry about losing our bat population because the little brown bats are dying from a disease. We used to have 8,000 bats. I tell them, you look in any encyclopedia, you'll find Chautauqua, looking up bats, you'll find Chautauqua mentioned, because we used to have 8,000 bats here every summer that gobbled up all the mosquitoes. But now they're dying. Someone had the good sense, if you look at the railings, next time you go by, look at the railings around the Athenaeum. All those cutouts are bats. They're in the shape of bats, different forms. So, in a way, we have memorialized our bat population, even though we're going to lose them eventually, but they're still there in the railing of the Athenaeum, which I think is kind of neat.
What's the funniest story you heard from one of your guests on the bus? Somebody raises their hand and says, "Hey, tour guide, I got this story."
Well, one guy raised his hand, and remember I told you about Carl Kurlander, and there are two bellhops. I know that story because my son was the other bellhop.
Okay.
And he knew Carl Kurlander, that he went to Duke and wrote all these stories. So people surprise me about all kinds of things. And many people take the tour quite often. So I'm always talking back and forth to them. They want to contribute whatever they want to contribute. And I'm trying to keep it down because they tell these people it's about an hour tour, but none of us can do it in less than an hour and a half by the time you go through everything and talk about things I haven't even mentioned here. How Chautauqua is run, and what it's like a small city. Let's face it, we got our own fire department, police department, water treatment plant. It's quite a project to maintain this place. They finally realize that, how big it is.
You then get back to the gate and you conclude your trip how?
What I do is I read everybody this. I tell them that Chautauqua can be summed up best by David McCulloch. And back in 1992, I guess, he gave a lecture that's still there, Chautauqua and its place in American culture. And this small quote sums up to me what I've been talking about to these people for an hour and a half. And this is what I read to them. "There's no place like it, no resort, no spa, not anywhere in the country or anywhere in the world. It is at once a summer encampment, a small town, a college campus, an arts colony, a music festival, a religious retreat, and the village square. And there's no place with anything like its history. I mean, in those few words, sums it up. In fact, I walk around with copies of that in my pocket, and time after time, a day or two later, somebody will spot me. Do you have a copy of that little thing you wrote? I give it to them because I think they grab that as a summation of everything I tried to tell them and things they've learned by being around Chautauqua. Mind you, some people go on the tour after they've been here a week. Some go on the tour the first day. Lori Stanton, when she has her Rhodes Scholar Group, they sign up on sheets to take different tours. That, to me, is a summation of what Chautauqua is.
Do you accept tips?
No. No. Rarely they
Because
try.
if you did, we would give you a tip tonight.
Yeah.
It's spectacular. Ladies and gentlemen, Bob Rader.
Thank you.
My man's got a question here.
Tell them about Carol's helpers in the summer with the aprons and stuff.
Oh, yes. Well, one thing Carol and I decided to do years ago, this is the largest organization we've ever been to that doesn't have a volunteer group. So we started a volunteer group. And Bud and many other people agreed to volunteer. And one thing we do is Saturday morning, or Saturday, all day Saturday, sometimes 900 cars come to Chautauqua visiting, and they're lined up on 394. So Bud and others, we go to the gate, the bus gate, and we give them a map, and the people who give them their tickets steer them over to us. We greet them at Chautauqua. We show them how to get to their location and their lodging because we have a map for that. We try to give information and give people a good hello to Chautauqua instead of just being funneled around. We used to walk the line when we had to wait for the chamber tickets on Monday, but Marty decided to do away with that because over the years he found that he never ran out of tickets because there's so many other things competing with chamber music that you just go to the chamber, to Lene Hall. We talk about Lene Hall and all the different music venues. Sherwood, for example, back the Women's Club had a 1898 or 1880 Steinway piano they wanted to refinish. When the Steinway Company found out about it, they were so enthused they came and they agreed to pay half the cost of doing the Steinway piano, which is one of the reasons why Chautauqua is one of 3 venues in the entire United States that every piano in every place, except the one in the parlor of the hotel, is a Steinway. They bring in brand new Steinway pianos for everything. Joan had a question. She wants to talk about her.
I just wanted to make an addition. The other day, my daughter Megan, she gave me a definition for Chautauqua that it meets her techies, you know.
Oh, yes.
She said Chautauqua is just like Ted, except it lasts all day and all summer. And then I have to tell you something else. This Christmas time, I got a big package from Ted Arndt, Nancy Miller Arndt, and Nancy he has put together a book with all Nancy's notes and family, and asked me to go through it and add to it. She was my assistant at the children's school and my travel companion and a good friend. So I've been going through it. It's going to be absolutely amazing. Very different than the rest of the history books. A lot about the Edison thing.
One thing I left out very important. Because O.W. wrote so many letters, a lady named Meredith McMath wanted to write an opera about the Civil War. She found out about these letters. She went to Sherman to look in the library to find out more about Norton because she knew he wrote so many things about the Civil War. She met with John Schmitz, who gave her more information, and she wrote an opera. She was the librettist for this opera. The name of the opera was Norton, a Civil War opera, which was produced back in last year in April, and Cynthia went to this opera, and the opera was about the life of O.W. Norton, the bugler, and how he first person to play taps, and it was all about the Civil War, and it was got great reviews, and it was because of what he wrote. I read these letters, many of them. They're just beautifully written letters. I mean, he almost died many times in the Civil War. And one battle in Fredericksburg, the Americans had, the Union Army had 150 cannons blasting away at Fredericksburg, and the rebels were doing the same thing, and the whole city was destroyed. And the men went into the city and ransacked every house they could, and the end of the paragraph was, we ate slapjacks instead of flat all day long because they went into the kitchens and cooked. The country was in ruins. That's why I say that Chautauqua was a breath of